Questions of Doom.
Hello and welcome back to another Questions of Doom. In this series, as ever, I attempt to answer questions that you send my way using the archaeosoup@gmail.com email address, as displayed on the YouTube channel homepage, but as you'll also see at the end of this video. In answering these questions by video, it is my fond hope that the answer is not only useful to the person who's asked the question, but also anyone else out there who may be wondering the same thing. Today's question has to do with the potential for human extinction and the potential for archaeology to help us be aware of and maybe even avoid certain fates. It goes like this. Dear Maestro Soup, good morning. I hope you are well. I am well, thank you for asking. I just thought I'd send you an email to pose a question about human extinction. Obviously, this is a possible, if not probable, future event. But what does archaeology and the past have to say about the extinction of Homo sapiens? Are there any models which predict how we might go extinct? Is there any evidence which might help us to learn from and avoid such a fate? Don't get me wrong, if we have a time to go, that's just fine with me. But how might archaeology be useful in helping and reassuring human beings in the face of a potential extinction of our species? I don't know about you, but I think that's a fairly good use of evidence from the past. Thank you for your time, Saurine Lover 78. Well, Saurine Lover, it's worthwhile briefly explaining. Saurine is a type of fruitcake here in the UK. It's sort of like a malt loaf with raisins in. And even though it's a fruitcake, this is not the question that a fruitcake would ask. This is actually a really good question, and a question, again, that I might not have thought to ask myself. This is why I love doing Questions of Doom videos. They're so stimulating in that sense. And I suppose in order to try and answer your question, Saurine Lover, first of all, it's worthwhile saying that it's really difficult to find a good analogy for the extinction, or possible or probable extinction, of Homo sapiens. That is to say, even though there have been lots of different extinction events of human-like creatures, for example, the Australopithecines, Paranthropus, and other species of Homo, Homo sapiens have developed an extremely robust and complicated buffer against predation, against environmental concerns, and also health pressures, which might wipe out another species of human being. In other words, we have a very complicated cultural buffer. We have houses, we have clothes, we have healthcare systems, we have communities which, for the most part, look out for one another. We have all sorts of factors which make it very, very complicated and make it very difficult, for example, for a bird to come along and eat one of us, whereas these things didn't necessarily factor with other forms of human being on this planet. Secondly, past extinction events, for the most part, took place in a world where there were other types of human being around. That's no longer the case. We don't have another type of human being trying to kill us, or trying to outcompete us, or trying to outbreed us. We have made this world relatively safe in that sense. There's not another similar species out there trying to do us in. Also, well, the pathways of evolution aren't fully understood. What may well be seen as an extinction, the ending of a particular species, could simply be that species changing into another one, the evolution of a species from one to another. That's not quite the same as an extinction event. It's simply the adaptation of that species physically and culturally, I suppose, in response to environmental pressures. So extinction isn't always the end. It can actually be the beginning of the next stage, as it were. But I suppose the closest analogy that we can look at would be the Neanderthals. It seems they had culture, and there's an increasing evidence of a capacity for speech, or at the very least passing on information using vocal cues, as it were, complex societal interactions, care for the infirm and the elderly, potential burial rites, for example. There's an assumption of a form of material culture amongst the Neanderthals, whether that was copied from other species of human, for example, Cro-Magnon man or Homo sapiens, or whether they actually developed their own material culture is very hotly debated. But the point is, they definitely had a cultural buffer. They existed in Europe, for example, and in other parts of the world, in different types of environment and in different extremes of environment. For example, in Europe, they were here at some very cold times, extremely cold times, and they survived. Neanderthals were actually in Europe from between 6 and 350,000 years ago, so between 600,000 and 350,000 years ago, to around about 25,000 years ago, or 24,500 years ago. In other words, they were here, they were alive, they were around on Earth for longer actually than Homo sapiens have been. We've been around for about, give or take, 200,000 years. They were around for well, a minimum of about 300,000 years. So they were a very successful species. They were shorter than us, they were stronger than us, they were stockier than us. They had particular, it seems, physical adaptations such as a large nose, a lack of a chin, and other things which we're still, again, talking about, trying to understand the purpose behind them. But the point is, they were a very successful species, and they probably offer the best analogy for trying to understand how we might go extinct. Now, Homo sapiens, us, we moved into Europe, for example, around 40,000 years ago. So sort of about 20,000 years before, or maybe 15,000 years before Neanderthals went extinct. For the most part, Neanderthal extinction hypotheses, actually, they surround us moving in. They sort of revolve around this event. So it seems that maybe we contributed to them disappearing. But there are 4 key extinction hypotheses. So I'm going to examine the hypotheses for the Neanderthals and see how that relates to us. So the first one would be rapid extinction events. That is parasites and pathogens. The idea being that either a new bacteria or viral strain developed which killed the Neanderthals, or it was brought in by us. We brought in new illnesses which they simply had no resistance to. Now, colonialist history actually really highlights this risk. Smallpox, especially in Mexico in the 1500s, I think 150,000 people were killed in the Aztec capital. Massachusetts Bay Native Americans in 1618 and 1619, so in about the space of a year or two, they were wiped out by smallpox being introduced from Europe. You shouldn't underestimate the capacity of an isolated bunch of people to be very, very vulnerable to incoming strains of illness. Smallpox also ravaged Australia and New Zealand, for example. And that's a very real risk for us now, today, as it were. You know, it's a historic risk for Homo sapiens, and it's still a risk today. I mean, I don't know, in 1918 to 1920, there was the flu pandemic that killed between 50 and 100 million people and infected 500 million people on the planet. It's astonishing, really, how vulnerable we can be to such events. And with the rise of, for example, bugs like MRSA, which are resistant to conventional means of eradicating them, for example, antibiotics, that looks increasingly likely. Now, that said, though, we do have those buffers that I was talking about. We have medical systems and research structures which are trying to combat these possibilities, but it is nonetheless a possibility. So I'd say that, yes, that's something to learn from. A possibility, possible extinction events happen with the Neanderthals, but we are, it seems, hopefully sort of on top of it. The second rapid extinction event would be violence, whether that's endemic, that is people killing each other. There is a theory that Neanderthals might have actually killed each other out through fighting over land, territory, this kind of thing. Or that we might have killed them. We might have actually moved in and literally eradicated, committed genocide, as it were. It may well have been actually that there was a halfway house there, and that is that our expansion forced Neanderthal communities into a smaller piece of land, or pieces of land, which then caused social friction in their groups, and therefore they eradicated each other. But the point is, that is a possibility, and that's still a possibility today. Civil wars, wars in general, new types of weaponry, we see it every day, and it's only getting more and more intimidating. Our capacity to kill each other en masse is ever more present. So that's a very real possibility. And again, this theory, which is a possibility with the Neanderthals for an extinction event, is very much relevant to us. But again, hopefully we will stop short of that. But it's hard to say. It's really hard to say because all sorts of complicated matters come in, which is a whole other video, I suppose, all about, you know, the political will, for example, to stop violence. So yeah. So those are the two rapid extinction possibilities that may face us, and did possibly face the Neanderthals. Now, when it comes to Neanderthals, there's also a sort of a slower event, and that is interbreeding and deselection of Neanderthals. Excuse me, there is evidence that the Neanderthals and humans, and Homo sapiens, sorry, they're both humans, Homo sapiens and Neanderthals actually interbred. Most Homo sapiens outside of Africa have between 1 and 4% Neanderthal DNA. And that's not to say people put far too much onto this. They say, oh, well, I'm part Neanderthal then. In a very small sense, and a very long time ago, yes. But the point is that there's a possibility that Neanderthals simply disappeared because they were no longer, their traits weren't being selected for, and what was left of them was this little percentage of DNA in our DNA. Now, that's not necessarily a possibility with us. For example, we can't interbreed with another form of human being on the planet because, well, there's only us, there's only Homo sapiens at the moment. But, and I have to say, actually, if it was possible, I'm sure that's one of the first things we'd try. If aliens, for example, landed on planet Earth, we'd either lock them up, study them, or try and interbreed with them. I'm pretty sure that's one of the three things that we'd do, or try to do. But the point is, though, actually, there is an interesting modern analogy for that, and that is genetic research. The fact that we can, and are starting to, actually, select and deselect attributes in our young, in our offspring. Babies, for example, fashion babies almost. That's an interesting possibility, and the fact that there's a potential for a species to completely change and completely disappear because of deselection is something which we may be doing to ourselves through technology. And that's a very interesting one. There's also the interesting possibility as well of halfway houses, these people who are humans who are not one or the other really. I mean, for example, some people look at the possibility of human Neanderthal hybrids. For example, the child of Legor Velho in Portugal, who died around about 24,000 years ago, right at the end of Neanderthals being around. This possibility of there being this sort of not Homo sapiens, not Neanderthal, this thing that's in the middle. Now, that's a very hotly debated find, by the way. But this technological development that we have may well lead to actually there being another form of human on the planet. That's something to consider, I suppose. There's also far less rapid extinction events, essentially revolving around competition and adaptation. So one of the ones would be that Neanderthals didn't have the same division of labour that we had. So we were very good at dividing labour up, whether it's between women and men or young and old or whatever, and therefore we got lots of jobs done at the same time by different people. Whereas Neanderthals, it's suggested, might not have had that. They might have, everyone goes out on the hunt, or everyone goes and fishes, or everyone goes and picks berries or something, and that might have been something which went against them. Also, physical capabilities. For example, the fact that they were stockier might have meant that they weren't quite as good at running as we were. That said, though, they were much stronger than us, and yet they didn't survive. So there's various ideas there, but they won't necessarily contribute to our extinction because we're not competing with another form of human being, but we are often competing against each other, and this can lead to the rapid extinction events such as war and violence. So that's something to bear in mind. There's also hunting. I mean, there's the idea that actually Homo sapiens had a really good capacity for planning ahead, for thinking about where, for example, animals would be on their migratory trail and intercepting them, whereas Neanderthals might not have had that capacity. This is just one idea that's out there. This idea of planning might have led to us being able to outcompete Neanderthals in terms of hunting. There's also the early domestication of dogs. There were two domestication of dogs events of dogs. One happened around about 30,000 years ago in the Altai Mountains, where Russia, China, Kazakhstan and Mongolia meet. And then that dwindled out, but then we re-domesticated dogs around about 10,000 years ago. So our capacity, I suppose that highlights our capacity for adaptation and the use of the environment around us, which maybe the Neanderthals didn't have. And while none of that is something that we necessarily have to fear from other species of human being, it's maybe something that we should bear in mind in terms of how we approach one another in a world where, say, for example, resources are becoming increasingly scarce. A world where we need to try and possibly be aware of the fact that maybe we can't forever have the latest mobile phone because of the rare earth elements that are involved in making that phone. Maybe this bottleneck of resources and that form of competition is something that we need to be starting to think about now, because this bottleneck of resources between Homo sapiens and Homo neanderthalensis, between the Neanderthals and us, it seems might have led actually to some people who were a bit more savvy out competing those who weren't quite so savvy. And maybe we need to be starting to make difficult choices about our use of resources and the environment in the next 50 to 500 years. That's something to bear in mind. The fourth dramatic event would be, I suppose, or extinction event, would be climate change. Now, lots of people don't like to think about climate change, but when it comes to the Neanderthals, it seems that they may have been very susceptible to climate change. Before we even arrived in Europe, Homo sapiens arrived, there was a dramatic cold phase, a very long time when it was cold, which almost led to Neanderthals dying out entirely. This could have been due to a lack of cultural buffers, helping them to survive the cold, but more likely it was also linked with the animals that they relied on and hunted, dying out. There are, for example, around about 40,000 years ago, evidence of pollen studies that show that plant life dwindled dramatically, and therefore the herbivores that they would have hunted, Neanderthals would have hunted, would have probably dwindled in line with their food source, the plants, and therefore that might have led to Neanderthals suffering and almost dying out. So they were very susceptible to and very sensitive to changes in the climate, it seems, or possibly very sensitive. That said, though, they did live in various environments. They lived in cold and warmer environments as well. We found them, for example, in the Middle East as well. Slightly different ways of living, but nonetheless very adaptable. So I'm not saying that they were just, so sensitive that if you showed them a heat lamp that they'd just pass out. But that potential for the climate to possibly almost wipe you out is something that we possibly need to be aware of. Climate change, in my mind, is a very real thing. It probably is exacerbated by human activity. The UN, for example, has accepted this in recent days and months. And I suppose the one positive that I would say about climate change is that actually we are shown in archaeology to be very adaptable. So for example, one of my favourite examples is the Mesozoic mammoth bone huts. There people are living in some of the coldest environments that you can imagine on planet Earth, and we're still surviving. Homo sapiens living and thriving in very harsh conditions. So from that end of the spectrum all the way through to where we are now, through to people who survive in extraordinarily barren desert environments, we are very adaptable. So archaeology highlights that, but also the Neanderthal situation with climate change highlights that we can't adapt to everything, and eventually there may well be a climatic change that does lead to our extinction. There's also as well, actually, obviously the possibility of so-called supervolcanoes. Apparently around about 70,000 years ago there was a supervolcano eruption which may have almost wiped out human beings on the planet, but we haven't really experienced the supervolcano as it were, and if and when, say, the Yellowstone National Park volcano goes up, this huge volcano in Idaho in the US, when that erupts, that could present the biggest possible challenge in terms of climate and environment and atmospheric pollution to human life that we've ever faced. It could present the defining challenge to our species, potentially, actually. And that's one that I don't know, I'm not sure. I'm not sure whether or not archaeology shows that we will adapt to that, or whether it shows that actually, for example with the Neanderthals, that a dramatic, sudden change in the environment can kill you out. And that one, I'm sorry to say, I have no really positive answers for. But as I say, we are aware of those challenges at the very least. We are aware of the possibilities, and that has to count for something. The awareness of our own extinction is, after all, part of our cultural buffer. We're aware that extinction is a possibility. Previous species of human being weren't necessarily aware that they could just all die out. So that has to count for something. There's also, of course, for example, other dramatic events, such as, say, a meteorite hitting the Earth, or I don't know, even aliens, you know, coming and enslaving humanity. But I'm not really going to touch on those because they are very much on the fringe of archaeology, but also on the fringe of our capacity to survive. I mean, if a genuine planet-killing event occurred, like a massive meteorite hitting the Earth, and leading to the extinction of most life on the planet, I'm not sure archaeology has much to say about that. There hasn't been that kind of event for humanity, and certainly affecting humanity. So yeah. That said, though, arguably that kind of event did lead to the eventual evolution of mammals as being the dominant form of life on the planet. So again, even that's not an end. It is a beginning. Also, finally, it's worthwhile touching on the fact that there is such a thing as the voluntary human extinction movement. Apparently, there's a group of people who want us to voluntarily not have children, so that the environment and the Earth can recuperate following a horrible experience with humans taking advantage of Earth. And that I find fascinating, because obviously the observation that the environment is suffering is based on the fact that we're here to observe it. If we're no longer here, sure, the environment may well get better, but there's no way of measuring that improvement. So that's a fascinating concept, the idea of voluntary human extinction, but one which I think is a bit strange, and I'm fairly sure that archaeology and archaeological theory doesn't really accommodate for people wanting to eradicate themselves. That takes a level of awareness and self-awareness which I think the modern world is not uniquely equipped to do. People in the past have been very self-aware, but the modern world is uniquely equipped to propagate that notion of mass voluntary human extinction, and that's one which, it's an interesting idea, but I'm not necessarily convinced by it, I have to say. So there you have it, Saurian Lover 78. Hopefully this has been an interesting or useful discussion. The closest analogy that I could think of for human extinction was looking at the Neanderthals. And we've looked at the 4 key reasons: the rapid extinction, the deselection, the less rapid extinction events, and also climate change. And I've tried to sort of to examine them, and then to see what we're doing about those things, and in that sense, hopefully this has been a useful way of tackling that question. I'm sure many of you guys have comments or queries or thoughts that you'd like to write below. Please do comment below. I'd love to read your thoughts, and if you know of any good analogies for human extinction, again, I'd love to hear about it, because I was racking my brains, and Neanderthals are the only ones which come close, but even they were competing against another form, or they were at least existing in a world with another form of human being, and that's something which we're not doing. So yeah, it's a very interesting question, so thanks so much for asking, and hopefully this has been an interesting video. So I'm aware this is probably quite a long video, so I'll wrap it up there. Until next time, as ever, do take care. Bye bye.